Okay, so more often than not, I feel like the most overlooked part of anyone's system is their monitor. So today we're going to talk about some monitor tech, what some of the specs mean, and some of the nice to have features and features that kind of drive up the price on monitors, because I have a feeling going into the beginning of 2025, a lot of people are going to be looking at upgrading their panel. So let's see what we can do today to kind of educate you and get you ready to buy your first or maybe your next upgraded panel so that you don't overspend, but get the features that mean the most. For those looking for a high-end custom gaming experience, look no further than Falcon Northwest. Falcon Northwest has been building PCs made for gamers for over 30 years with a focus on a true high-end gaming experience. Custom cases available only through Falcon Northwest feature state-of-the-art testing and design to ensure that every component is performing at their best through thermal imaging and rigorous lab testing designed and overseen by the Falcon Northwest founder himself. With a complete lineup of systems ranging from small to large, every Falcon Northwest system includes a 3-year warranty policy and a year of 2-way overnight shipping coverage, providing the ultimate peace of mind. To see all that Falcon Northwest has to offer, follow the sponsored link in the description below. So when we talk about panels, we have to talk about the main type of technology that it is. Now things have sort of changed over the years. For instance, there used to be TN panels, which were really common, which stands for twisted pneumatic. Then we had VA panels, which were for vertical alignment, and then IPS, which stands for in-plane switching. Now, typically in the past, TN panels were the cheapest. They had the fastest response times. They had the lowest prices. You could get them in pretty decent size. But fortunately, as time has gone on, IPS, or the most color accurate, which was typically the type of panel you would see in like, photo editing, video editing type of environment, because they could get as close to lifelike when it came to the actual colors. But fortunately, the price of IPS has come down dramatically. So TN panels and VA panels have kind of been slowly disappearing, getting replaced with even very inexpensive IPS panels. Now, one of the drawbacks to IPS panels for years was the fact that they did not have the fast response time and refresh rates that TN panels did. So as the technology has improved, we're gonna really just kind of talk about IPS panels when we talk about LED, but just know that TN panels and VA panels do still exist, and they kind of have their drawbacks. For instance, TN panels have some of the weakest viewing angles. So that means as you're sitting there looking at the panel in off viewing angles, it would start to have kind of a foily, sort of an inversion that would sort of happen. And that's just because of the way that the panel is designed. They could give you really good response times, really fast refresh rates, but they also had the weakest color recreation in terms of accuracy. They almost had a very vibrant, reds could sometimes look pinks. I mean, there was just, the color accuracy of it wasn't good, but for gamers who didn't care, it had a nice punchy screen and it was really, really fast. VA panel tended to have kind of the middle ground between IPS and TN, also giving fast refresh rates, but they weren't as fast as TN and they weren't as accurate as IPS. But they kind of gave that middle ground between the two. But like I said, we're gonna talk about IPS today, or in-plane switching, when we talk about our LED panels. Now, when it comes to the viewable size of the panel, you'll see a measurement, whether it be 27 inches, 32 inches, 24 inches. That is always measured in a diagonal measurement from corner to corner. So this is a 32-inch panel here from ViewSonic. This is actually one of our test bed panels. So this is an IPS mini LED panel. Now you're gonna see that technology kind of mentioned. You're gonna see potentially edge lit or LED or mini LED. So as LED panels have sort of progressed, being able to fit more LEDs in the backlight means that you can get better local dimming. Because the only way that through an LED that you can actually get a dark scene to look dark is by turning off the backlighting behind the panel. Otherwise, when the pixel gate closes, there's still some light bleed that makes its way through. So blacks always look smudged or they look gray, and they just don't look good. So by mini LED panels means that we have thousands of LEDs behind here, giving a larger area of light, but also more LEDs that we can dim or turn down in a particular area to give us better contrast ratios. Now, it's kind of hard to get a perfect infinite contrast ratio when you're talking about something that is being permanently backlit. Now, edge lit refers to a panel that has lighting around the corners or around the perimeter of the screen, lighting it sideways, then relying on foil to reflect the LED light through the pixel gate. So what you tend to find with edge lit LED is kind of what's called flashlighting in the corners, because as you hit this corner right here, you'll have a higher density of LEDs in the corner, so you'll get what looks like flashlighting in the corners. Fortunately, as mini LED has become less expensive to manufacture, that becomes less of a problem because the LED array is very uniform behind the panel rather than being on the edges. Now, before we move into some of the other technologies here, we're going to talk about some of the main specs. We're going to talk about refresh rate and response time. Now, one of the things that IPS kind of lacked in the past, as we talked about, was IPS didn't always have the fastest response time and refresh rate. They were 60 hertz panels, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 millisecond response time, which was fine, because if you're sitting there editing video at 24 FPS or even 30 FPS, and you're playing games at 60 hertz, that was fine. But as gamers sort of demanded faster and faster panels, IPS wasn't able to keep up. Fortunately, as time has gone on, we now have high refresh rate, fast response time panels. So the refresh rate is usually referred to as a hertz rating, or how many times the picture can refresh itself in 1 second. So a 60 hertz panel would mean that the image can refresh itself 60 times per second. As panels progressed, that number started getting higher and higher. 100 hertz, 120 hertz, 144 hertz, 165, 175, 240, 360, even 400 hertz panels exist now. Now that brings us to the other equation of the formula. You might be able to refresh the image itself in terms of data and presenting that image X amount of times per second, but the actual pixel itself also has a speed rating, and that's referred to as response time. That's how fast the pixel itself can refresh based on the information that's being sent to it. So let's say, for instance, we have a 8 millisecond response time gray to gray. That means it takes the pixel 8 milliseconds to change colors from gray to white and back to gray. So that number itself specifically refers to ghosting and motion blur. So let's kind of put that into perspective. So let's say we have this panel could do 240 hertz, or it can refresh the image 240 times per second. If it doesn't have a fast response time, or the pixel is slow, that means you're going to have an image that's previously been drawn still sort of fading out as the next image is showing up. That leads to motion blur or ghosting. Ghosting is actually way worse than motion blur. We all are used to motion blur. You look around right now, just move your head, you're gonna see motion blur. Ghosting is terrible because that's where you actually will get trails of images left behind, and you can see clear cuts between those trails, and that's actually a very gross, almost a nauseating experience. So when we talk about the response time, gaming panels typically land anywhere between 1 to 5 milliseconds. In fact, we even have panels going as fast as 0.5 milliseconds now, as the response time gets faster and faster. So if you're gonna get a fast refresh rate panel, you wanna make sure it's paired with a fast response time. Otherwise, you can start leading to a lot of ghosting. Now, we talked about the diagonal viewing size, 32 inch in this instance. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a 24-inch panel or a 32-inch panel, if it's 4K or 1440p, also known as QHD, or Full HD, which is 1080p. Just because the panel's bigger does not mean it has more pixels. The pixels are just larger to fill the space. So for instance, this is a 4K panel at 32 inches. If we were to look at the same 4K resolution in a smaller panel, it would actually look sharper. That's because there's less space between the pixels, and the pixels themselves are smaller. Now, space between pixels is also referred to as a screen door effect. Not something that's really too noticeable until you start going large format, and anything in the 32 inch and above is really considered large format. But 4K, when you start to look at, say, a 65-inch TV versus 4K when you look at a 32-inch monitor, text is where you really start to notice the pixel density or the pixels getting larger. So it's kind of a rule of thumb that if you're gonna go larger than, say, 27 inches on a panel, you really wanna go with 4K, otherwise 1440p, the text starts to look very blocky, and you start to actually notice the screen door effect between the pixels the larger the panel gets. Now, we talked about resolution, obviously 4K. We're talking about a measurement of horizontal versus vertical. So let's say 1080p. So we would have 1,920 pixels wide by 1,080 pixels high, giving us a 16:9 aspect ratio. Now, 16:9 is pretty common But I feel like more and more gamers are starting to make their way towards ultra wide. So this is actually the ViewSonic XG34 1C. This is their ultra wide panel. As you can see, it's obviously much wider. And this is actually referred to as a 21:9 aspect ratio. Now you can get these much wider now, where essentially they're just two 16:9s put side by side, which actually was 32:9. So you can get them in some pretty crazy widths now. Now you'll notice that this panel is actually curved. Now this curved is referred to as an R rating. So you might see 800R, 1000R. The higher the number in the R rating means the more aggressive the curve is. Now there's even panels that exist now that are bendable. That falls in the OLED category. We'll talk about that in a second. But the panel can actually be bent to the curve rating that you want. So that's kind of a nice feature to have. As you might imagine, bendable OLEDs are not cheap. So there's some price associated with that. But ultra-wide has actually started to gain a popularity, even if you look at the Steam survey, because of the fact that they give you extra wide viewable angle. So this would allow you in games to actually increase your FOV, so you could see more around the sides while maintaining, basically non-distortion. So the wider panel will actually allow you to have a wider viewable angle without the weird stretched out looks on the side, which you'd get by 16:9 if you went with like an ultra-wide FOV. So I personally have been using ultra-wides now for probably the last 10 years in full time. Typically you'll see them in a 3440 by 1440 resolution. That's usually the most common. That means we have 3440 pixels wide and then 1440 pixels tall. So giving us a higher pixel density, it's gonna make us have cleaner, sharper text. It's also gonna give us, like I said, more pixel on the width in terms of our viewable angles. The price does obviously go up because we're talking about a larger panel, more pixels, so there is more cost involved. But you'll see these resolutions also referred to as WQHD or W added to whatever moniker that they're putting in the letters, and that just basically denotes that it's wide or an ultra wide. Now 21:9 aspect ratio is also fairly close to kind of like the cinema aspect ratios once you remove the black bars. So there's actually a multimedia viewing experience benefit too to using an ultra wide, because oftentimes it detects that you're running a WQHD or an ultra wide panel. There's actually options in a lot of the players to actually fill out the screen and remove the black bars. You might have a small black bar on the side, but it actually makes it a nicer viewing experience because it fills out the screen. But when we talk about the specs, the refresh rate, the response time, the panel technology, whether it be TN, VA, or IPS, or even OLED, all of the other specs that we talked about apply in the same manner. It's just the format itself is wider. Okay, so this brings us to OLED now. This is the ViewSonic XG272-2K-OLED. The numbers mean stuff, I swear. So XG is the category of their panel, which is their gaming panels. 27 is the viewable, which is 27 inches. 2K refers to the fact that it is a 1440p. Yeah, I know. Trust me, we all know. That numbers kind of get confusing, but it means it's a 1440p, so it means 2560 by 1440, and then the dash OLED obviously means that it's an organic LED display. This is kind of like the latest integration of technology to make its way into gaming panels, which started as large format TVs, as OLEDs, now shrunk down into gaming size. Now, OLED or organic LEDs are very different than LCD screens. So liquid crystal display relies on light shining through pixel gates, and those gates either open or close, red, green, or blue, to determine what colors they're going to be showing, and then obviously that array creates your image. OLEDs, however, emit their own light. So instead of having a solid backlight behind them, it actually has the capability of each LED emitting its own light in the specific color at which it wants to emit. Now, where this really shows its benefit is in dark scenes, low lights, the fact that it has perfect infinite black, because a black OLED is just an OLED that is not illuminated. And you can see just how dark the screen is with no light coming through right now. That's exactly how dark it is when you're in a dark scene. And the cool thing is, if you have a darker scene, let's say you're in a cave or something, like you're playing like Tomb Raider or Indiana Jones or whatever, and you've got very faint like rock formation or maybe something in the shadows, instead of having everything else around it dim and then have what light is coming through to portray the dark scene, everything is off, and then only the dark scenes are actually emitting their own light at the luminance at which they're intended to basically portray that. So The technology is pretty awesome when we talk about panel displays. If you've ever looked at an OLED TV in like a home theater setup or whatever, then you'll know that it's pretty impressive what you can create in terms of its vibrance, its luminance, because we haven't even talked about HDR yet, as well as its low light capabilities in terms of dark scenes. The drawback though is most OLED panels have a glossier screen. So that means any sort of ambient light behind you when you're gaming, if you have a window behind you, the reflection can actually get pretty intense. Fortunately, the ViewSonic panels, they kind of fit in the middle of a full glossy screen and a matte screen, giving you better rejection at reflections. However, in order to get the bright, punchy colors that you find with OLED, they're typically coupled with a more glossy screen. So that's one thing to point out there. Now, as OLEDs have improved, they have some of the best response times on the market. You can see them get down as low as under 1 millisecond because the LED itself can respond much faster than the actual physical motion of an LCD pixel gate. They can respond much faster just through their own luminance. So you actually get very good refresh rates with OLED, as well as very fast response times. Unfortunately, OLED is the most expensive panel type currently on the market because it costs the most to manufacture. Now they have come down in price quite a bit, but that's one of those things where, let's say you've got a maxed out tower, you've got a high-end GPU, you're running a 4090 or a 7900 XTX, something crazy like that. You've got your X3D CPU, everything's maxed out. You don't have any sort of upgrades you could really make to your tower. This is where upgrading your panel can really start to show its benefit. Because if you've got a maxed out tower hooked up to, I don't know, a 1440p LED 10 panel, you have no idea what you're missing out on until you start to look at things like HDR, high dynamic range, when it comes to its brightness and its contrast ratios and such. One other thing that we haven't talked about yet either, specifically, is going to be panel sync technology. Now, it's a little less important today than it used to be because almost every single FreeSync panel is also G-Sync certified, but there was a while there where G-Sync panels only worked with NVIDIA graphics cards, FreeSync panels only worked with AMD graphics cards, and NVIDIA wasn't taking the time to really validate FreeSync panels to fit within their G-Sync, I guess, parameters. We'll put it that way. But the cool thing is just about every single FreeSync panel on the market now does actually work with NVIDIA G-Sync or NVIDIA GPUs. Now you might ask yourself, why would I even need a sync technology? Well, FreeSync and G-Sync are technologies that reduce tearing if your frame rate drops below the native refresh rate of the panel. So what that means is the panel itself is actually able to draw scenes faster than the GPU is sending information to it at that point. And you might start to see tearing where a scene isn't aligned, because believe it or not, your screen draws horizontally and not all at one time. It does it kind of in stripes, right? And they alternate oftentimes. So what happens is you'll start to see that image desync. So that's why you hear FreeSync and G-Sync. And so if your refresh rate is faster than the FPS that's being sent to it, you can start to get tearing. So what the technology does is it actually forces the sync of the image before it being drawn. So that's something that tends to matter most if you're running, let's say, a graphics card that can't keep up with the refresh rate of your panel. Let's say you paired it with a 240 hertz panel and you've got, I don't know, a 1660 in your system. You're not going to be running 240 hertz, so you could get all kinds of fluctuating FPS, which can lead to those tearing situations. That's where the panel itself will actually handle making sure that the scene is synced before it actually draws the image. Now on the flip side, you could also be running something like an RTX 4090, but you're running Indiana Jones, which we all know is a very difficult title to run currently because of the fact that it's very forward-facing in its technology and ray tracing is required, and you could have all the bells and whistles turned up. Now your 4090 is definitely not going to keep up with your high refresh rate monitor. So that's where the G-Sync and FreeSync monitor technology really comes in to make sure that those frames stay nice and fluid. So yeah, it's a nice thing to have. It used to actually be a kind of a premium sort of option on monitors, but every single gaming monitor on the market today either has FreeSync or G-Sync. You'll probably find more FreeSync monitors these days than you do G-Sync, simply because it's open source and it's actually very inexpensive to implement it because it's done on a software level, whereas G-Sync does it on a module level and it costs more to put the G-Sync module in a panel. So you'll find a lot more FreeSync panels these days than G-Sync. Okay, so you've got the fastest response time, you got the highest refresh rate, you're running a high-end gaming panel. You start to think to yourself, What else could there be to talk about? Well, some of the newest tech that we're starting to see in the last few years, MPRT, or moving picture response time. We talked about the fact that if a response time is too slow for the refresh rate of the panel, you start to get ghosting. Well, one of the ways they've started to combat that is actually by flickering the panel, or either severely reducing the backlight or even turning it off entirely in the background. So what I mean by that is it's starting to strobe very, very, very fast, faster than you can see with the human eye. In fact, we had to use a high-speed camera to even notice the fact that our VSync MPRT panels were actually dimming down to red color, actually, because red is probably easier for it to have that response time in terms of turning off and back on. But it dimmed to a very, very low red and back up basically every other frame. So you can't ghost an image you can't see. So the idea between MPRT is just the next evolution of response time, where you get much crisper, cleaner images simply because of the fact that every other frame is actually being dimmed. But you don't even notice it with the human eye. It's kind of nuts. It's happening thousands of times per second. Okay, so let's talk about a couple other things that could drive the cost of a panel up that you may or may not be interested in. We're going to talk about things like VESA mount. So VESA mount basically refers to whether or not you can put the monitor on an arm. So as you can see right here, we've got some screws that we would be able to mount a monitor arm to. And those are measured in millimeters. And the two most common sizes you're going to see, actually the most common size you're going to see is 100 by 100. That means it's 100 millimeters square between each of these holes, or maybe 80 by 80. 80 by 80 is not nearly as common, but it does exist. Other things too, if we look at the bottom of the panel here, we can talk about connectivity. Do we have multiple DisplayPort inputs? Do we have HDMI as well? Do we have a USB hub built in? Do we have maybe a headphone pass-through built in? You know, there's a lot of little features that can start to add up and bring the cost of a monitor up. Does it have RGB? Personally, for me, RGB on a panel, especially panels that have it on the back, unless it's really bright and it's like bouncing off your wall, I don't think RGB should be something anyone should be that concerned with when it comes to gaming panels. That's the thing. Gaming panel actually might be the one time gaming is an appropriate term to use, because the specs for a gaming panel are very different than a multimedia panel. So like a gaming computer case, that's just buzz term. I mean, does it have enough fan slots? Yes, okay, it's gaming now. But a gaming panel, high response or fast response time, high refresh rate. What is the panel technology behind the backlighting? If it had LED on the front, I guess for RGB, that's cool and all, but not something I think you should care about, to be honest. But does it have a rotatable base, right? So a lot of people go to their Discord channels and such, and I put a big finger smudge on there, so I'm sure that's triggering some people. But a lot of people like to have a panel vertical like this. Let's say they have Discord channels always going, or they're constantly on like Reddit or whatever. So people like to have it portrait mode like this because it allows them to have more that they can read before they have to scroll. Programmers for sure definitely like to have multiples usually like this. When I worked in software development, most of our guys had two verticals and then a normal, possibly even an ultra wide in the middle. But not all bases have this sort of adjustability, so I can rotate it either way. Sometimes they only rotate one way. Do we have tilt adjustment? You know, this one gives us about 15 degrees up, about 5 degrees down, which is pretty standard. And then we have our height adjustable built in. So all things to consider when you're buying a panel. Anyway, I hope this has given some food for thought on features in panels that can matter to you or may not matter to you. Fortunately though, panel tech as a whole has been driving itself down in terms of cost over the last 5 years. We have seen some major changes in pricing when it comes to panels. I think right now the perfect sweet spot, if you're trying to buy a gaming panel for someone, would be a mini LED, LCD panel, possibly 27-inch, 1440p resolution, 144 hertz refresh rate with a 1 millisecond response time. That would probably cost you under 300 bucks these days. And that would get you a huge, huge visual improvement over anyone running a 1080p 60 hertz panel. It would be night and day. In fact, most people have no idea what they're missing until they experience it and then try and go back. So sound off down below in the comments what your sweet spot gaming panel is and what you think absolute must-haves are for someone buying their first gaming panel. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.